Alright guys, we'll be talking about Russia and what happens with its reforms coming out of the Crimean War. Okay, so we left off talking how they lost the Crimean War. It's a turning point in Russian history because this is where Alexander II recognizes that they need to modernize in order to keep up. Russia lacks a sizable middle class, which means that throughout Europe, especially in Western and Central Europe, the middle class was the group that really promoted liberalism and those ideas and hoping to demand for more political participation, right? Involvement, the working class demanding for reforms. So reforms didn't really come at all up until the 1850s for Russia. And then as far as economically, politically, and socially, everything was in the hands of the Tsar. And you can see why Russia, right, up until 1850, we said how they did not even experience their Industrial Revolution, but now, though very far behind, right, a couple hundred years far behind, they are trying to catch up. Okay, the nobility, they are not looking to propose modernization because they were in control of their lands and they had serfs, which are, the slaves, farm slaves, and they were living, comfortably. So Russia, recognizing that they are vulnerable, is looking to expand themselves militarily and economically. So the Tsar at this point is going to be Alexander II. He's going to be the most liberal ruler in Russian history prior to the 20th century. Okay, so at this time, he's going to be the most open as a Tsar to see reforms. Now, coming out of the Crimean War, what is holding back Russia? It's really its system of serfdom. Basically, serfdom is rampant. It's the main foundational social structure that's in Russia, and so the agriculture that they had been investing in was all they knew. But at the same time, they're not going through an agricultural revolution. 90% of people that lived in Russia, 90% of the population, worked on farms. Okay, and the thing is that if you have 90%, that's not very efficient in developing new industries, right? You talked about during the Industrial Revolution and Agricultural Revolution, right? It started with the open field system, then there's enclosure movement, and slowly through the development of new planting, farming methods, right, and new technologies, you don't need as many people farming. But if you have 90% farming, it means that you're still using your labor inefficiently. Okay, so because serfdom was continuing to be rampant, it led to peasants uprising, trying to have riots. The output agriculturally is very low, and serfs are being exploited by the nobles. Okay, do you guys remember the nobles are the boyars in Russia? Okay, let's kind of review. And these serfs are being bought and they're sold, they're slaves, and they're not tied to the land. And a lot of times serfs can also be conscripted. Okay, and then comes the first reform, right? This major reform right here. Emancipation Edict or Emancipation Act of 1861. Alexander II believed that if he ends serfdom, Russia can then modernize. This is kind of the roadblock. So by abolishing serfdom, peasants are no longer dependent upon the nobles, and they can move freely. They can change occupations. However, the opportunity is definitely not there, and they can eventually own their own property, whereas before this is never possible. The main point is that the transition from the Emancipation Edict of 1861 did not provide great opportunities as it anticipated, because they're still living on mirrors. Okay, so mirrors are basically peasant communes, and these peasants are living together where they could be kind of regulated. And so at this time, there's going to be a division of property, and so who's going to own this property before it just opened? So that the nobles are saying, oh, you can own this piece of land, but that's a really poor piece of land because it doesn't have it hasn't shown that it's been able to grow full crops for a long time, but it's basically crappy land, and so the peasants are still given the opportunity to own it. So here we're going to see peasants are coming together. They're buying this property. They're investing their money in it, and so each family is investing. They pay taxes for it, and this is going to be a difficult thing because the peasants are tied to the land, right? Because they are in too deep by investing their money. They can't leave now, right? And they also have not been able to develop themselves individually as farmers. They're just basically working the land. Okay, so they're tied to that. And then the second part of the reform is going to be the zemstvos. This is going to be in 1864, and so this is where Alexander II is providing a local government structure, and in the local areas there's an administration of how the laws in the village will be run. This is going to be a step towards participation of the masses in politics, but it was not completely worked out. What I mean is that lords that are part of the zemstvos of the local government, right, they hold most of the power. About 75% of those that are in the zemstvos membership, okay, are nobles. However, only 1% of the population are of the nobility. So though they hold more seats and they have more positions in control, they don't represent everyone, and so that's going to be a problem for a lot of the towns and peasant villages. Other reforms we're going to see is the judiciary improved, okay, the court system. Also, censorship is going to relax a little bit, but still the monarchy is in complete control, so it's not completely gone, and education is going to be more liberalized, going to be reformed and offered. Okay, all right, and then we have the Industrial Revolution in Russia. So this is coming way late. This is coming in the late 1850s, whereas Great Britain has beat them by a whole century. Okay, they needed better railroads. Western and Central Europe has already established themselves, right, and they've had successful railroad systems. They need it too. They need railroads. Also, they need better armament, weapons, military personnel, and they need to reorganize their army. These are their needs in order for them to not be as vulnerable. So the railroad being as a huge factor, they're going to focus on constructing these railroads from 1860 to 1880. We're going to see the total mileage of railroads go from 1,250, okay, 1250 to 15,500. So basically 10 times as much in about 20 years. So they're rapidly focusing on trying to industrialize and set the railroads up, and by doing that they are now enabled to export the grain. So they have a lot of farming, they're not making a whole lot of money, but they are gaining some profits from exporting grain by, you know, the train loads, and this is going to help them have more capital to further industrialize their country. Then we're going to see that domestic manufacturing, what they can build in factories, are going to start rising up, right? We talked about Manchester was one of the small suburbs, not a major city, just a small town that eventually grew into a city. So industrial suburbs are going to be growing up around Moscow, the capital, and St. Petersburg, these two major cities. And from this, we're going to see that there's going to be a social class of modern factory workers. Okay, now it's a small group, but it's growing now because they have factories. The military in Russia over time is going to be stronger, and also they're going to look to expand their territory going southward and eastward. Okay, all right. So as far as what's going outside and how they deal with their expansion, we talked about this before. We're going to revisit this because during the 1870s, the Eastern question arises again. And so the territory that they're looking at is going to be the Balkans. Who's going to control this territory, this region of Europe? Because who's in charge of it? The Ottoman Empire has been in charge of the Balkans for a long time, but this empire has a bunch of different ethnicities along with the Austro-Hungarian Empire too. And so the Ottoman Empire is at its decline. It's called the sick man of Europe. It's slowly dying and receding in southeastern Europe. One example is Muhammad Ali is a governor of the Ottoman Empire, specifically in Egypt. And so he's gaining power, right? And he almost was able to dominate the entire, a lot of the North African, Middle East portions of the Ottoman Empire. But the balance of power of the Western powers of Great Britain, France, Germany. They wanted to keep the Ottoman Empire weak and dependent, so they did not support Muhammad Ali in his takeover. But he was growing at that time because there's a nationalism that was going on in Egypt, right? He's telling them how they are no longer just Turks because they're not, right? So within major empires, this is the problem, especially with Austria-Hungary as too, right? So Russia and Austria-Hungary are looking both to establish themselves to retake territory in the Balkans, and the problem is who's going to take it, right? So that's the issue in question. Pan-Slavism was where Russia believes that, hey, they have a ethnic affiliation with each other. They're all Slavic people, and so Russia can establish this united Slavic group. And so eventually there's going to be a war in 1877 to 1878, the Russo-Turkish War, and this is where Russia was able to have a victory over the Ottoman Empire, except that you have the Western and Central European powers step in, balance of power. Britain did not want to see Russia be successful in controlling the Balkans, and so they helped the Turks. And what happens is that this movement of jingoism comes in. Jingoism is basically this extreme nationalistic spirit in saying we support aggressive foreign policy, and we want to take down other countries. We are stronger than them. So there's a lot of British people that were favoring this, but also Bismarck wanted to help mediate and settle this whole dispute of the Balkans between the Turks and the Russians, and so they set up the Congress of Berlin of 1878. Now, this is where they're going to talk about who gets what land coming out of this Congress. Russia would gain not that much, okay, even though they are the victors. So what's going to happen? Well, Romania, Serbia, Montenegro, they become independent states. So if you remember on your map, okay, this is going to be right in the Balkans, Southeast Europe. And then you have Bulgaria, right? They're still going to be part of the Ottoman Empire, but they're going to have their own autonomy. They're going to be independent in the sense of governing themselves and having their own principality, but still within the empire of the Ottoman Turks. And Austria will gain Bosnia and Herzegovina. This is where the whole World War I assassination of Archduke Francis Ferdinand is going to happen. Okay, and then Great Britain's going to obtain Cyprus. Okay, that's going to be an island. All right, so Russia comes out not really getting much, and Russia, though it's really Benjamin Disraeli that's responsible for a lot of these things, Russia is upset at Bismarck because he's setting up the Congress of Berlin, and so Russia is going to have some hostility towards Germany, and Bismarck is now going to look to set up, sorry, this isn't outcomes, Bismarck's going to set up a new alliance system that's going to lead us into World War I, and basically the whole allegiance and alliance of the continent of Europe is pretty much no more. Europe has now moved on. Okay, one thing to know is Congress of Berlin is talking about the redistribution of land in the Balkans after the Russo-Turkish War. Okay, the Berlin Conference, different. Okay, Berlin Conference is in 1886. Okay, this is later on. This is going to be where in imperialism they're talking about how are they going to distribute land in Africa. Okay, so don't get those mixed up. All right, so at the end of Alexander II's reign, he's going to be known to be he's going to turn more conservative over time. So he was liberal, but he's actually turned more conservative because over time he realized that in order to hold power, he can't be just continuing just to reform and give away power. And so the romantic period in Russia is now evolving to more of realism. Okay, so it's following the movements, the ideological movements, and people are still gaining more participation through a movement of popular sovereignty. Okay, and people are demanding for this radical movement to happen. They want to have a utopian agrarian order. Okay, so an ideal society where the redistribution of land is more fair. Okay, And other critics of the Tsar Alexander II is a group called the Intelligentsia. And the Intelligentsia are basically a group of intellectuals, and they wanted to restructure the government. They wanted to take over society and no longer have the Tsar, and they had a lot of thoughts of how they can change Russia. Okay, then you have nihilism. Nihilism is where it's another group of intellectuals, and they are more along the lines of anarchy. They rejected authorities. They rejected the Orthodox Church. They rejected the Tsar, and they believed that the social order at that time should be completely wiped out and built up from scratch. Okay, and so a lot of people, though they are seeing reforms in the time of Alexander II, they were still not satisfied, still discontent. Eventually, Alexander II will be assassinated in 1881 by radicals. He was traveling in his horse carriage, which was bulletproof, so they bombed it. And over time, as several bombs were thrown, okay, by this terrorist group, he was kind of like blown up in half, and then he was dragged by, I guess, by another carriage to the Winter Palace. And eventually, it was 20 years after he had signed the Emancipation Edict. And as he was bleeding, right, he was in front of his family, the Romanovs, and they were seeing everything happen, and he died before their eyes. Okay? All right, then his son, Alexander III, in 1881, is going to take over. He saw what just happened, right? His dad was very liberal, right? He became more conservative, but then Alexander III realizes he can't just follow the same path as his dad did, because that's what happens when you give away too much power and you work with people that are demanding for things, right? So he's going to be very reactionary, right? Very reactionary. I mean, can you really blame him? So, three things he focused on: autocracy, absolute power; orthodoxy; and Russification. Russification is basically nationalism for the Russian culture, okay? So in this time, he's trying to take hold of all of taking control of complete power over Russia. And one of the things that he recognizes is that there are the Jewish people that are the problem. Okay, and so anti-Semitism is going to start being on the forefront of the Russian people's minds. And there's these things called pogroms. Pogroms are violent attacks, and it is actually legal by law, and so the government is actually participating and enforcing this. So in the 1880s, these pogroms are showing that they're targeting Jews, they're persecuting Jews, and so they are blaming the Jews for the assassination of Alexander II. They are the problem. Russians wouldn't do that, right? But it's the minority group within Russia. And so what do? Well, they begin to destroy the homes of the Jewish, destroy the businesses of the Jewish, and so the lives that the Jewish people had created and established for themselves in Russia are now being destroyed, and they're not welcome anymore. And so what do? Right? So the plan was that they would either have them immigrate, right? So they would leave Russia, or they would convert them to Christianity, or they would just face continual violent persecution, even death. One thing to know is that the pogroms after Alexander III, during the time of the next Tsar, Nicholas II, is going to have more Jews killed than during Alexander III. It just began with him. Okay, began with Alexander III. So then we have Theodor Herzl, who is an Austro-Hungarian journalist. Okay, and he I believe is Jewish himself, and he is advocating for Zionism. Zionism, as we know, is the belief that Jews should look for sanctuary in their own Jewish homeland, that their nationalism should give them a nation state. And where should it be? Back where Israel is today, was before, and this is in the Holy Land, right? It's in the Middle East. And in order to stop the persecution of Jews in Europe, especially, which is going to be Central Europe and Eastern Europe, this is where the Zionist movement is going to evolve and develop. What I was going to say is, yes, Russia is going to be the last country in Europe to actually make the persecution of Jews illegal. Okay? All right, moving on, we're almost done here. So, During the time of Alexander III, going into the next Tsar, Russia is going to expand economically even more. Okay, Count Esvovit is the prime minister of Russia during this time, who is pushing for a lot of industrialization in the 1890s. And so what is he going to do? Well, his aims are, he wants to have capital investors, right, those that have the money from Western Europe, Central Europe, to come in and start investing, building manufacturing plants, factories, industries, and also bringing their technology over. And so factories are starting to get going in Russia. This is going to bring the rise of a small Russian middle class, and over time this will grow a little bit, but still very much Russia has a ton of peasants. By 1900, we are going to see that Russia is going to become fourth in steel production. Okay, we have the U.S., Germany, and Britain as the top three. Also, by 1900, Russia is going to export half of the world's refined petroleum. Okay, oil. Oil is a huge part. Siberia, Russia, a lot of natural resources. Oil is one huge thing. Okay, by 1900, railroads. We talked about how railroads is going to be like a huge thing that they invest in. We talked about how it went from 1250 miles to 15,000 miles, and now by 1900 we're going to see, 20 years after that, 35,000 miles. It doubles again. So one major is the Trans-Siberian Railway, right? So you're going from Moscow to Vladivostok, and this is going to be 5,000 miles across. And so now they can go from European side of Russia to the Asian side, the Asian border of Russia. Okay, and they can transport resources, goods, personnel, all that good stuff. Also, what allows them to improve the economy is now their monetary, their currency is held by the gold standard, so they can actually have an exchange rate with other European countries, and this is going to help support the government's finances. Did we talk about steel production already? We talked about that. Steel production. Okay. So by industrializing your country, this is going to lead to many people beginning to hold and share the Marxist ideology. So socialism is going to start like growing in a lot of the working class movement, and it's going to really fuel the political parties that are being established. The political movements, you're going to have your Social Democratic Party, and it's going to split between the Mensheviks and the Bolsheviks. We'll get into this more specifically during the Russian Revolution, but just to let you know, a lot of the industrial workers at this time felt very exploited because of industrialization of their country. Surprise? No, right? We've seen this before. Okay, so despite economic and social reforms, Russia's going to have a lot of economic problems. One is that all the farmland in in Russia is not going to be used efficiently, and food production could not stay at the same pace of the increasing population. Russia is going to be the most populated country in Europe by 1900, basically. And so from this, there's going to be a lot of people, not enough food, right? That's not good. And then you also have the Depression of 1899, where a lot of the economic expansion, industrial growth of the 1890s is going to drop because of unemployment. Okay, so unemployment is a factor of depression, economic depression, and what's going to top it off is that Russia is going to get into war with Japan. Okay, and so at this time, this is where Nicholas II is going to be taking over. He is going to be leading the Russo-Japanese War of 1904-1905. What's happening? If you guys have seen Nicholas and Alexandra, the movie, right? He talks about this in the beginning of the movie. But they get crushed. Okay, they wanted to build a sphere of influence in Manchuria and Korea in their Asian side of Russia, but they were defeated. They were humiliated. Japan totally owned them, and their navy and army was more superior. Russia eventually says, you know what, we're not going to handle Asia anymore. We're just going to focus on the Balkans. Okay, so because of this, people begin to realize, hey, this war that this king is supposed to lead, right? Tsar Nicholas II is supposed to lead, not a very good leader. Empty promises, did not fulfill. Okay, then comes the revolution in 1905, right? So the end of 1905 is where the poor economy that's happening and also the cost of war led peasants to demand reforms. The middle class also is demanding reforms. And what happens is there's a major event called Bloody Sunday. This happens in January 1905, and 200,000 workers and peasants are marching to the Winter Palace in demanding for reforms. They were not armed. They were not trying to start revolt. They were just marching there, and the Tsar was not there. Okay, the Tsar's guards, the army, the Russian army, just began to fire upon the crowd, killing tens of thousands of them. Okay, what ends up happening is because of the strikes that were happening and the revolts were happening, Russia began to be paralyzed, and it was not moving forward. And the Tsar, looking at what was happening, was forced to make some reforms and concessions and trying to listen to the people and work with them. Okay, before that, right, his father, father, Alexander III, was very reactionary, not going to listen to them at all. Kind of iron fist, put the control down, put your foot down. But now Nicholas II is kind of having everything slip through his fingers, and so he's established the Duma. So the Duma is kind of like a parliament, and this assembly would serve as kind of an advisory body. So how the structure works is that Tsar Nicholas still has an absolute veto. He can veto anything he wants. He holds that power, and so the Duma doesn't really have that much power, but they kind of meet and talk and try to talk about the issues that are going on in Russia. They are given also the freedom of speech, assembly, and press, although that's not complete as well, right? The Tsar can kind of stop things as he pleases, but this is kind of leading to the demise of finally the Russian monarchy. The Romanov family that has been in power for 300 years is going to end, and basically those of the Duma, just like in every other parliamentary government, is mainly those who have property, are of more of a wealthy background, not the workers and the peasants and the minorities. Okay, they're not being represented. Okay, last few points. Well, you have Peter Stolypin. He's going to be prime minister, and he's going to improve some agrarian reforms. Russia will go through a mild economic recovery. They're not going to be in the dumps leading into World War I, but they are still not prepared amongst all the other nations to engage in war. So, sorry, I didn't put this bullet point. Peter Stolypin. Okay, so what are these agrarian reforms about? They are trying to change the collective village system, the mirs, right, of how they own land and share land, and to make it more where peasants themselves are able to manage it themselves. Not successful, really, but it was a step in that direction. After 1911, leading into World War I, there's a lot of criticism of Tsar Nicholas and his court, and then you have this dude named Rasputin and his influence, and many people began to doubt his leadership. Okay, and then we're going to go into World War I after this. All right. Quiz tomorrow.